Hello, everyone. Professor Kuzluk here. So, in recent days, the term neoconservatism has reemerged in debates about U.S. foreign policy, sometimes as a label, sometimes as a critique, and sometimes as a revived strategy. So, to understand why, we need to step back and ask a basic question. What is neoconservatism? Where did it come from, and why did it come to shape American foreign policy thinking and then incorporated in this? Is why have we started to hear it again, see it written in articles? You may have heard it in the context of the Venezuela operation that the U.S. undertook. This idea of neoconservatism and its role in shaping American foreign policy. So, neoconservatism is not just a partisan label or a moment in time. It is a foreign policy worldview, a way of thinking about power, about morality, and America's role in the world. It really sits at this intersection of realism and idealism, borrowing elements from both while rejecting parts of each. So, at its core, neoconservatism argues that American power should be used actively to shape the international system, not merely react to threats. Neoconservatives believe the United States is not just another great power, but a uniquely capable and morally justified actor whose leadership is essential to and for global order. So, okay, neoconservatism really emerged in the late Cold War period, particularly in the 70s and into the 80s. Many early neoconservatives were originally liberals or left leaning intellectuals who became disillusioned with what they saw as naive views about international politics, authoritarian regimes, and the limits of American responsibility. They rejected they rejected the idea that international politics could be managed purely through diplomacy, institutions, or balance of power restraint. Instead, they began to argue that power matters, that adversaries understand strength more than accommodation, and that failure to confront threats early leads to greater dangers down the road, greater dangers later. Unlike traditional realism, however, neoconservatism places values, especially democracy and human rights, at the center of foreign policy. And unlike liberal internationalism, neoconservatism is deeply skeptical of international institutions when they constrain U.S. actions. So, in short, neoconservatism combines a realist appreciation of power and threats with a moral belief of spreading democracy and a preference for unilateral or US led action instead of multilateralism or utilizing international institutions. So, there are several core beliefs that define neoconservative thinking. First, neoconservatives believe in American primacy. The United States should remain the dominant global power and actively prevent the rise of hostile rivals. A unipolar world, led by the US, many neoconservatives argue, is more stable and safer than a multipolar world. Second, they place democracy promotion as a strategic necessity, not just a moral preference. Democracies, in this view, are less likely to fight each other and less likely to harbor threats. Supporting democracy movements abroad, even through force, if necessary, is seen as advancing long term security. Third, neoconservatives emphasize military strength and a willingness to use that strength. Deterrence requires credibility. If the United States threatens consequences but fails to follow through on those threats, it invites future challenges. Neoconservatives are, as we mentioned, skeptical of international institutions and the constraints that those international institutions place on American power. Organizations like the United States are often viewed as slow, ineffective, or dominated by states that do not share U.S. values. When institutions conflict with U.S. objectives, neoconservatives argue that U.S. should act anyway and disregard those international institutions. Finally, neoconservatism is deeply shaped by lessons drawn from history, particularly the belief that appeasement leads to disaster. Historical analogies, Munich in 1938, the early Cold War, the failure to stop aggression early, play a powerful role in neoconservative arguments. So neoconservatism has never been necessarily a mass movement. Its influence has come primarily through elite networks, policy institutions, and government appointments. Key intellectual figures include people like Irving Kristol, who you might recognize the Kristol name because of Bill William Kristol, who I believe is on the Bulwark now, is still reaching mass audiences. So Irving Kristol often is described as the godfather of neoconservatism. And Paul Wolfowitz, who you've probably encountered maybe in your history courses or through if you read about the lead up to the Iraq and Afghanistan war, the architect of the Bush administration. So Paul Wolfowitz, who played the central role in shaping post-Cold War defense strategy. Probably names you've heard before, even if you didn't associate them with neoconservatism. Other influential voices like Robert Kagan, who has argued that American power underwrites global order, or Victoria Nuland, who, if you followed the Russia-Ukraine conflict since 2014, probably a name you've heard before, Victoria Nuland, who is associated with assertive U.S. Engagement abroad. So neoconservatives have often worked through think tanks and policy groups, these ideas coming out of think tanks. Importantly, neoconservatism has crossed party lines. While most closely associated with Republican administrations, especially under George W. Bush, neoconservative ideas have influenced Democrats as well, particularly on issues involving military intervention, NATO expansion, and democracy promotion abroad. For many students, neoconservatism is most closely associated with the Iraq War. So the 2003 invasion of Iraq represented the clearest expression of neoconservative thinking in practice. The belief that removing an authoritarian regime would trigger democratic transformation, reshape the Middle East, and importantly, enhance U.S. security. So maybe in your history courses, you've learned about the arguments leading up to the Iraq invasion, even if you are too young to have lived through that period. The aftermath of the war, insurgency, instability, and long-term costs of the conflict produced a backlash against neoconservatism. Critics argued that neoconservatives and neoconservatism underestimated nationalism, sectarianism, and the limits of military power. For many years after Iraq, neocon, we can put that in quotation marks, became a term of criticism rather of influence. Maybe over the past week or month or year, when you hear neoconservatism, you may have heard it in a negative manner. Oh, that's a neocon, or they have neoconservative ideas. So we do know that neoconservatism has reemerged, not because Iraq was forgotten, but because new global conditions revived old arguments. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's growing assertiveness, and concerns about authoritarian expansion have renewed debates about deterrence, credibility, and democratic solidarity. In these contexts, neoconservative arguments at least, use power early, defend democratic allies, avoid appeasement, have regained traction in policy circles as well as just society in general, how we talk about how to handle threats around the world. Neoconservatism also benefits from moments when restraint appears risky. When adversaries challenge borders, norms, or alliances, calls for caution sound like weakness. Neoconservatives thinking thrives in environments defined by fear of decline, loss of credibility, or erosion of global order. At the same time, neoconservatism today often appears in modified form than it did, say, 2 decades ago. Fewer advocates today argue for large-scale regime change. Even the discussion over Venezuela that we've heard over the past few days, many pundits and many neoconservatives have still been seemingly distancing themselves from simply talking about regime change in Venezuela. This is different discussions than we heard a decade or 2 ago from many of these same folks. So instead, more emphasis is placed on military aid, alliance leadership, sanctions, and forward deterrence rather than direct occupation. So neoconservatism remains contested. Again, if you've been following the news over the past few days, while neoconservatism has been talked about, you've heard criticisms against the theory itself. So critics continue to argue that it overestimates the effectiveness of military power, that it underestimates cultural, historic, and political complexity, that it encourages overextension and permanent war, that it blurs the line between moral goals and strategic necessary. Of course, you have heard probably some counters to these arguments. That supporters argue that power vacuums invite aggression, that deterrence requires resolve, that democratic backsliding has real security consequences. We've been hearing this discussion that the security consequences in Latin America or in the Western Hemisphere. You've heard the Trump administration talking in these terms. You've heard that discussion about American withdrawal often creates instability rather than peace. So these debates are not necessarily abstract. They shape real discussions about military aid, alliance commitments, sanctions, and of course, that we're living through, intervention. So when we think about why do we care about neoconservatism, remember we're learning about ideas, we're thinking about some of these big ideas and theories and concepts. So the most important takeaway is neoconservatism is not just a historical curiosity from the early 2000s. It is a reoccurring response to moments of perceived global disorder. Understanding neoconservatism helps students and helps all of us decode foreign policy debates, identify underlying assumptions, and distinguish between different visions of American leadership. When policymakers argue that the U.S. must lead, stand firm, or defend democracy abroad, neoconservative logic is often close at hand. Whether one agrees with it or not, neoconservatism remains one of the most influential and honestly controversial ways of thinking about American foreign policy. And that's why it makes it important for us to continue to think about it. Thank you.